Hello, Father Stephen. How are you?
Not too bad, Father Scott. Good to see you
Very good to be with you.
again. It's a beautiful day in Saskatoon. What's it like in Middletown, Connecticut?
A little cloudy,
Uh,
partly cloudy.
I miss those. Connecticut is such a beautiful place. Are the flowers bursting out?
They are.
Yeah,
The
are
buds are on the trees.
just coming out. And that's the mystery of Easter. Although it's an Easter in which I'm looking right now with our director of sacramental preparation, how to celebrate uh, a moment that 20 children in my parish have been longing for, and that is their first Holy Communion. And we have a great procession that we usually have that fills the street with all kinds of joy, and I don't know if that is going to be possible this year. And there's a sadness in all of that, and sometimes people get a little bit angry, and that's okay, because angry comes from sad. But you have to be able to turn the sad that leads to anger, take that energy and turn it into passion for something new. And that's why I think that you and I and priests and Catholics all over the world are dealing with something, a kind of encounter with the Lord in the Eucharist that none of us really were prepared for or even studied much about. I'm a sacramental theologian, and I can't recall ever teaching about this spiritual communion, which people are called to. What's your understanding of spiritual communion?
I really haven't. Um, like you said, like I never really thought about it. I never really read about it. I mean, there's not much. I think until recently there wasn't really anything out there. I mean, you might get the prayer, prayer for spiritual communion, but real understanding of what it is and what it isn't.
That's right.
I'm
And I
hoping that
think,
you can maybe enlighten me today.
oh,
And
well, I have been working a little bit on this because I want to explore this. This is, in all things, to be a student means to be eager. Studio studiare means to desire more. And it's like when you're in a relationship with anyone, you want to know more and more about them. I know it's kind of hard for old friends like you and I, especially for you to hear my old stories over and over again. But then if I tell a new story, oh, that's kind of interesting. And you tell me a new story about, oh, I'd like to learn more about that. And so here's a new story in our relationship with Christ. Spiritual communion is something that the church understands as arising from times when people cannot receive the Eucharist. For example, a dear friend of mine right now, her name is Edna. By the time people see this, she will have probably gone, she will have gone home. Edna is unable to swallow right now. So when I come and bring viaticum to her, which I did once, brought the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, but she was not able to swallow and to receive. So instead, I held it before her and I asked her to make a spiritual communion with the Lord present there. What is this spiritual communion? Well, I think it leads us to come back and ask, well, what is communion itself?
right, yeah.
What happens when we receive communion? It's actually, I like better to use a different word. Who happens when we receive communion? Because there's always this very strange thing that we meet it as the bread. We meet him as the bread of life. So in a sense, we want to say, receive it or bring it to me. But it's actually a who, receive who, and how does he come to me? Well, we think about the different kinds of presences that people can have. Like you and I right now are present to each other. Right? We are in communion, even though you are 2,000, 3,000 miles away, way on the other side of the continent, and I'm here in the middle of the prairies, as beautiful, the center of the British Empire. But we're sharing communion. We are actually really present to each other. And yet, there's something missing in that communion. The kind of normal ways that we have of relating, of being able to be in the presence of the person, to touch them, to smell them. You know, as earthy as that is, I think it's a lovely image, because yeah, it's exactly. No, don't worry. Yeah, that's the thing about, as an old priest with my cassock, how often do I get it clear? Oh, here comes Father Penna. I can smell him from a mile away. But smell is a very important sense of communion. Eh? It's a primordial one. I just think right now, if I say to you, what's the smell of your Mima's house? I'll bet you can remember it. What did Mima's house smell like when you walked?
Well, it smells that I associate with fried chicken.
Yeah.
Fresh
And
biscuits.
as soon as you say that, there's a kind of a communion, because we really do connect. And in fact, smell is a powerful memory sense. In fact, it's probably the most powerful memory sense. That when we smell something, we have all kinds of associated realities with it. That's why it's really hard to be separated from people, and to use for me, to use these means of communication, even on the telephone. I don't like talking to my mom on the telephone because I can't smell her, right? I mean, I don't have that kind of, I can't reach out and touch her, right? I can't hug her. So.
Well, it also limits like what you, I mean, it's one thing, I mean, there's more to being present to and present with people than just talking. And so it really, I mean, I think two people can be, I mean, two good friends, two, you know, spouses, you know, families, they can be together without really speaking to each other, but still be very tuned in to each other, so that there's, you know, the nonverbal ways of communicating gets lost with this, because this is a very verbal way of communicating. And if you're not speaking, then you might as well just have a picture of the person.
You're right. And that it's true. And you can also, sadly, be in the presence of someone and not be present to them.
Yeah, you just ignore them. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Sit there and look at your cell phone, or be distracted by something else, and be somewhere else. It's the worst thing in the world when you are talking to someone and you can see that they're not really looking at you, but they're looking past you, that they're more concerned about what their next appointment is. And we live these structured, appointed life. So the same thing goes now to our experience of being present to Jesus in the Eucharist, okay? So the depth of what Jesus wants for us is for us to be in communion, sharing gifts with each other. He longs for the gift of our openness to him. He wants the gift of us saying, come into my heart, be with me, transform me. And he does that in such a way that he risks putting himself into our hands, into our mouth, with the possibility that we will just not think about him, or we will take him for granted, or that we will go, having received him, and go and yell at someone in the parking lot, or be mean to someone somewhere else. He entrusts himself to us, and what are we going to do with that reception? The worst kind of thing to do would be to be indifferent to him, to look past that moment, right? There's something very, very hurtful about that. So what we are called to do at this moment now in absence, it's like with other things, like you can go over and talk to your mom over and over and over again. My mother's still alive, thanks be to God. But if you aren't able to be present to her, and you know, it's just when you've been away for a while, like right now, that we haven't been able to give each other a hug, that I realize how important that is. Yet I still go and am present to her. So what does that mean? I go and at a distance talk to her, even sometimes over the phone or through the glass window. And there's a community right there. There's a communion. But it's not the communion that I long for. Let's take the image of say a fellow that's overseas on a military expedition, working in in Iraq, Iran, as many people in Canada and the United States have had to do, husbands and wives doing this. And they do this teleconferencing and they talk to their children and they talk to their wife. And there's a real communion there, right? There is a connection and their soul. There's a spiritual reality because the spirit is not limited by space. Nonetheless, though that's a real communion, what do the husband and wife want? They want to hold each other. They want to make love. And that intimate, physical communion is of a whole different nature. Now, it is possible to, as you and I have counseled many couples, it's possible to sort of go through the motions of lovemaking and not really be present to the other person, to be distracted. And so the absence can really bring to a heightened sense the depth of that kind of intimacy. And I want to use that image as the intimacy with which Jesus comes to us in his body in communion. So spiritual communion is real communion in the spirit of being present to Jesus in the Eucharist. It is, however, as for anyone in a relationship of intimate love, not enough. There are a couple of things, though, that the church does teach. If you are going to be in communion with the other person, you have to really, first of all, be in a state of grace to have spiritual communion with Christ. It's like this. If I'm a soldier overseas and I've just been doing horrible things and talking about my wife in a terrible way, you know, I'm so glad that I'm far away from her, blah, 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 right? And then I get on and I'm happy to see her. Is that real communion? Am I being honest to her? I have to be faithful to my relationship with my wife if that is going to be the spiritual communion that I want. So too, in our relationship with Christ, we have to be in a state of grace. The other thing is simply we have to believe that Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist and want them to be present. It's not enough for a guy that's a long distance from his wife to go, whoof, when it's all done. Well, that's over with. At least I got that out of the way. There's that communion. As if the longing in his heart wasn't for her, right? So the same thing goes for us in our communion of the Eucharist. I want you in the Eucharist. So for a lot of people for whom Eucharist isn't part of their life in a regular way, you know, because they go to Christmas and Easter.
So the spiritual communion is like if a husband says to his wife, you know, I love you more when you're not around.
Exactly. You would never. Well, spiritual communion would not be good spiritual communion if you say, I love you more when you're not around. It's I love you. I want you to be around.
Desire, or not the desire, but just to say like, oh, I don't need to receive actual communion. I can just settle for spiritual communion. That would be like saying.
Right. I'll go through the motions, or it's even better if I get to do it in your time. Some people said, you know, I've been watching, this is great. I can go to mass and work out at the gym, or, you know, schlep around the house in my pajamas.
Yeah,
you know, isn't that just great? Well, hold on a minute. You know, here's the challenge with all of that is, you're right. It is easier to do your own thing and fit people into your life. But is that a real relationship? Like, it's the same sort of thing as when people say, I don't need to go to church to meet God, right? You know what? Yes, God is the creator of all things are held in him. However, if you start fitting God into your life and say, I'm going to meet you on the golf course today because that's what I want to do in my day, or I'm going to meet you by sleeping in a little bit more and I just stretch and say, oh God, happy morning, happy Sunday. Who's God in that relationship?
When I hear people say, oh, I can pray to God, you know, wherever I am, like, that's fine, but how often do you actually do that? You know,
that's very true.
I mean,
and see, so that's why
Jesus, God, when you're taking a walk through the woods, but is that what you're really doing?
Right. And I think it's both and the key to all of this, and Jesus understands this, is actually having a real human relationship, which involves body contact. Worship of God means bringing your bodies to God. You and I taste this whenever we celebrate Mass, and we get this. As hard as it is that when we celebrate Mass and say, "This is my body given up for you," I've realized at moments in my life, and Father Raniero Cantalamessa, the Pope's preacher, gave words to this for me. I mean, it was sort of something inchoate, something I had never articulated. But he said it very simply, that we are actually speaking the literal truth. When we are pastors and priests, we're saying, "This is my body, people. In Jesus, who gives you his body, I'm giving you my body."
I think Fulton Sheen says something similar, that says the same thing, that, that when the priest says, "This is my body," he's talking about the host at that point, but he's also talking about his own body. Like, this is Christ's body, that our bodies become.
And so this is the way in which we have spiritual communion. It is real communion in the Spirit. And it is always a communion that is oriented to its realization in the Eucharistic celebration, in which my body, united with all the bodies of those around us in the Spirit, are united in the worship of Jesus, the high priest, in whom we are high priests, of his offering of his body to the Father for the life of the world. We long for that. It's a communion that is real and always oriented towards communion in the Eucharist. And so I really pray that people, that's why we're doing this, that hopefully someone will listen to this or read this and be,
Says you and me.
read this.
Others will.
Yeah, that they will be able to sort of say, yeah, I really long for him. It might, and because the sadness is whenever you meet people who just sort of take Jesus's presence in the Eucharist for granted. The old days, it used to be a habit that men were supposed to take their hats off whenever they walked past the church, or stop and say, "I worship you, O Christ. May you be glorified in all the tabernacles around the world." Truly present in the to pause and acknowledge his presence there, waiting to feed us. So I hope
to what you were saying about the physical part of it, actual communion. To go back to Catherine and Faustina, I was talking about last time. What's what I find amazing is that, if there are two people, and I think this is true for all the saints, but if they had real spiritual communion with Jesus, the intense mystical experiences that they had on a regular basis, the ecstasies, all that, they had spiritual communion.
Yes.
In abundance. But there was still that desire and that need to receive communion, to receive the body and blood of Christ, the way the rest of us do, who don't have those intensely spiritual experiences. So I think it just it goes to what you were saying just now. It is both and. The spiritual communion is kind of a, under certain circumstances that's acceptable, but if you can receive communion the regular way, that's the fullness of it.
Yes, because the sacraments, Jesus came for humans, not for angels.
Right. Yeah.
Well, let's have a pause on that then, and we'll come back and have another conversation about these moments, something else.
Okay.
Happy Capu. Enjoy, oh Cappuccino friend of mine, a cappuccino today.
It's already, it's 4:00. I might have to wait until the morning.
Well, I'm off to celebrate Holy Mass.
Okay. Well, God bless you. Good being with you, Stephen.
God bless you. Good being with you, Scott.
Okay.
Peace to you.
Peace.